dangerous realm. I would assume that most of you have heard of the Bermuda Triangle, but maybe less of you have heard of the area termed by Joseph Citro as the Bennington Triangle. This triangle centers around Glastonbury Mountain, an area that was once booming. Well, if you consider 200 people or so to be booming. It was an industrial and logging area in the 19th century. The area is most well known for a string of missing persons that started around 70 years ago. The Bennington Triangle is the eerie setting of a number of unexplained disappearances, unsolved murders, and paranormal sightings over the last 200 years. For tonight's margarita, we are honoring a major industry of Vermont, maple syrup. I know, maple syrup margarita sounds disgusting, but just go with me. I think you might enjoy it. We will start, as usual, with 2 parts tequila, and to this, we're actually going to add 2 parts orange juice. It's like a breakfast margarita. And then to the 2 parts orange juice, we add 1 part lime juice today and 1 part maple syrup. It's a lot of maple syrup, just be warned. But it is delicious. Probably the same as if you had some pancakes. I don't know. We're going to put the lid on. And we're going to shake this one pretty vigorously. I used real maple syrup, but it's still syrup, so you're going to want to make sure it incorporates well by shaking vigorously. Make sure it combines. I'm going to pop the lid off. Beautiful. Bougie, bougie, bougie. Here we go, people. Strain, strain, strain. Into a sugar-rimmed glass. It's too much of a breakfast drink not to do a sugar-rimmed glass. And we're ready to hop into the mysteries. The setting of today's story is the Glastonbury Wilderness, a massive 22,000-acre forest northeast of Bennington, Vermont. Despite the area's proximity to Bennington, it is isolated and quiet. The forest land, and specifically the massive amounts of beech trees, provide an important habitat for the black bear population. In fact, claw-marked beech trees are a pretty common feature in the area. The hilly terrain has several mountains that are taller than 2,000 feet in elevation, and Glastonbury Mountain is about 3,700 feet in elevation. Glastonbury has a large variety of different beautiful trees, as well as fruits such as blackberries and raspberries, and then of course, beautiful mountain flowers. The area known today as the Bennington Triangle was mapped by Benning Wentworth in 1761, and he mapped it out without ever stepping foot there. Already off to a pretty good start, wouldn't you say? The area itself has incredibly rough terrain and a pretty short growing season. Not the best place to have a lot of people live. Those trees that grow on Glastonbury Mountain, they're pretty good for logging. She's back. Can you let me finish? It did develop into a mildly bustling industrial area, particularly for logging. Lots of nice trees. And there were several buildings that were built up in this rugged terrain, including large company houses for the loggers, a school, and more. The Bennington-Glastonbury Railroad was formed in 1872, and it would be the steepest railroad ever built in the United States. The track was 9 miles long, and it climbed just a wild figure of 250 feet per mile. They used this railroad, obviously, to cart lumber down the mountain and to cart supplies and people up the mountain. By the late 1880s, however, most of the mature trees had been cut down, and so the logging industry really died in Glastonbury. The economies dipped dramatically, and in an effort to save the whole area, and particularly the railroad, they rebranded Glastonbury as a tourist destination. They switched from rail cars for a traditional train to trolley cars, and they transformed a lot of the buildings, including turning one into a casino. In the summer of 1897, they opened the town as a vacation destination, and it did have a pretty successful first season. However, after the first season, there was a major flood, and it washed out most of the train tracks. This pretty much ended the town for good. It was just too high up, and the conditions were just too extreme to think about rebuilding. All that remains there now are decaying, empty buildings. It's essentially a ghost town, and it was actually unincorporated by the state of Vermont in 1937. The legend has it that at the time, there were only 3 people living in Glastonbury, and they were all related. That legend wasn't really far from the truth. I think it actually wasn't a legend. I think it was the truth. This is an incredibly rural area, and for Vermont, which is a fairly rural state, that's saying something. A local indigenous tribe, the Abenaki, called Glastonbury Mountain cursed. They refused to go up into the mountain at all except when it came time to bury their dead. According to the Abenaki, the 4 winds met there in an eternal struggle. And in fact, the erratic wind pattern on Glastonbury Mountain is noted. If you take a hike there, you'll notice that the weather can change really dramatically and really drastically all of a sudden, and even the plants there grow at really odd angles. There is also an Abenaki legend of an enchanted stone. This stone is in the mountains, and if you accidentally step on it, it will swallow you up and you will never be seen again. Well, that's one reason I would avoid the area. Some say that if you venture into the timberland of Glastonbury Mountain, you can't even hear the sounds of nature. Not even animals want to live there. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 different people disappeared in the Bennington Triangle. On November 12, 1945, a group of hunters led by Mitty Rivers began an expedition on Glastonbury Mountain. Mitty was an experienced hunter and fisherman who actually lived in the area. He was 1 month shy of his 75th birthday. He was 5 foot 6 inches tall, had shock white hair, and wore glasses. He and his group were hunting in the area known as Hell Hollow. The irony is not lost on me. On the way down the mountain at about 4:00 p.m., Mitty made his way just ahead of the group of hunters, and he disappeared without a trace. The area was thoroughly searched. More than 300 locals, Boy Scouts, and Army soldiers searched the entire area for a total of 8 days. But some sources say nothing was ever found of him, and some sources say that the only thing that they found was 1 single cartridge from his rifle. That unused cartridge was found in a nearby stream. His disappearance caused what would be the first big manhunt on the mountain. But after a snowfall on November 20th, they could not continue the search. There were lots of theories about what happened to Mitty Rivers, but in truth, his disappearance just caused a lot of anxiety amongst the residents because he was incredibly familiar with the area and a very experienced outdoorsman. Paula Weldon was the daughter of a very wealthy industrial engineer. He actually designed many household products, including fancy cocktail shakers. So I guess we have him to thank for our margarita shaker. Paula is probably the most well-known Bennington Triangle disappearance. She was an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College. She had a lot of things that she enjoyed, including swimming, dancing, and botany. She was also a pretty avid hiker. She left the college at around 2 p.m. on December 1st, 1946. She had told her roommate that she was going to be hiking the long trail after she finished her cafeteria shift. She liked to work extra shifts in the cafeteria to make money. Her roommate had mentioned that she seemed like she was a little depressed or in a funk lately. Paula was wearing a red parka, blue jeans, and white sneakers. She was also wearing a small gold ladies' wristwatch.
At 4 p.m., she encountered a fellow hiker and asked him how long the trail went. The hiker responded that the long trail goes all the way to Canada. That was the last person or one of the last people to ever see her. The search for Paula was massive. Her father funded the whole thing. They used a helicopter for the first time in Vermont history to search for someone, and her father offered a $500 reward for information about the disappearance. As a result of her disappearance, they actually created the Vermont State Police. Many people, including Paula's father, criticized authorities for their lack of sophistication in searching for Paula. For many years, people have claimed to see Paula in places like diners, but nothing has ever been confirmed, and the case remains open still today. James Tedford disappeared exactly to the day 3 years after Paula Wedford on December 1st, 1949. He was a veteran and a resident of the Bennington Soldiers' Home. He had been visiting his wife and other relatives about 3 hours north of Bennington. People who knew him said he was seeming pretty depressed, and he had mentioned not wanting to go back to the soldiers' home. He was 5 foot 5 inches tall and wearing a cap, gray suit, and army overcoat. An acquaintance also saw him in Burlington, and he told them that he was headed to Bennington. However, upon arrival in Bennington, all that remained of James was the bus timetable left on his seat, and his luggage was on the bus. By the time he was reported missing, it was at least a week after the fact, and it appeared that James just vanished into thin air. On October 12, 1950, 8-year-old Paul Jefferson was left unattended in his family's truck while his mom went to go feed pigs at a farm where she was a part-time animal caretaker. When she returned an hour later, little Paul was gone. Search parties were formed to go look for and find the boy, but despite the fact that he was wearing a bright red sweatshirt that should have made him more visible, no trace of him was ever found. Bloodhounds did track him a good few miles from where the truck was parked, so it appears that he walked for quite some ways, and he was on his way to Glastonbury Mountain. His father said that Paul had been asking to visit Glastonbury Mountain and had said that the mountains were, quote, calling to him, unquote. A popular theory at the time was actually that little Paul's parents murdered him and fed him to those pigs on the farm. 16 days after little Paul disappeared, Freda Langer also disappeared in the Bennington Triangle. She was an experienced hiker who knew the area very well. She, her husband, and her cousin had decided to take a camping trip near the Somerset Reservoir. At one point, she and her cousin Herbert decided to go for a hike. They started on their hike, and when they had barely begun, Freda actually fell into a stream and got her clothes all wet. Herbert decided to stay and wait for her while she went back to the campsite to change her clothes. This was evidently very short, like a 10-minute walk. Freda never made it back to her husband at the campsite. After quite a while, Herbert, who was frustrated that Freda never returned, went back to the campsite to discover that she had disappeared. 2 weeks of searching commenced, with helicopters, airplanes, and the newly formed state police. In addition, 300 searchers looked for Freda, but they failed to find her or any trace of her. Unlike the other 4 disappearances, however, her mostly decomposed body was found on May 12, 1951, in an area that had been searched thoroughly when they had initially looked for her. The body was so decomposed that cause of death could not be determined. So what do these cases have in common? Well, first of all, in terms of proximity, they all happen within the Bennington Triangle, which is a relatively small geographic area. Secondly, they all happened within a 5-year time span. Next, their last known sighting was between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock p.m. for all of the victims. And finally, they all disappeared in the last quarter of the year, either October, November, or December. 4 of the bodies have never been found, and the one body that was found in an area that was very thoroughly searched. There have been several additional disappearances before and after this time period. For example, a trio of experienced outdoorsmen disappeared in 1981. But wait, there's more. Are you drinking yet? Because I certainly am. In March of 2018, an airplane crashed in the Bennington Triangle with no known cause. Ramsey Sampson Awney, who was the pilot of the plane, died on impact. He was an experienced pilot with 6 years of flying under his belt. When controllers last spoke to him, he was flying somewhere between 3,200 and 4,000 feet, when a 5,000-foot elevation was needed to avoid terrain. And here we go. Bigfoot allegedly stalks Glastonbury Mountain. He is known to some as the Bennington Monster, and he's been spotted on and off since the 1800s. He's known to be super tall, over 8 foot tall, and very hairy, of course. Sometime in the early 1800s, he knocked over a stagecoach and ran off roaring. In November of 1943, Hunter Carl Herrick disappeared. His body was found 3 days later. He was surrounded by huge prints, and the autopsy indicated that he had been squeezed to death. As recently as 2003, spotting of Bigfoot is relatively common within the Bennington Triangle. In addition, reports of strange lights in the sky as well as odd odors have gone all the way back to pre-colonial days. Most notably, a flying silo-shaped object was noted above the Bennington Triangle in 1984. There are also 5 inexplicable rock piles to be found on Glastonbury Mountain, otherwise known as cairns. They're very old. They're dated to pre-colonial era, but remember, the Abenaki tribe, who had been there since that time period, never went up the mountain, so who put those there? Today, Glastonbury has 8 residents. But of course, there are hikers, paranormal enthusiasts, UFO spotters, and a bunch of other people who've never actually heard of the Bennington Triangle. There is a house still standing there today, and it is the home of those 3 residents who were living there when Glastonbury was unincorporated, the original homestead. This episode freaked me out way more than most of the other ones. I know it doesn't really make sense, but there's something about like the known, a person killing another person that's different to me than the extraterrestrial or the paranormal or the unknown. But to be honest, I think I'm probably more of a skeptic when it comes to this kind of stuff. The Abenaki, remember, described this place as the place where the 4 winds meet. It is the belief of the Abenaki, and has been forever, that the entire area is unsafe. The winds are too strong. They'll cause you to get turned around. The noises are unsettling, and it's just very easy to get lost on Glastonbury Mountain. People who have survived getting lost on Glastonbury Mountain tell tales of thinking they're just steps away from their car, but as it turns out, they're miles away from their car. It seems like even wilderness experts like Freda or Mitty could realistically get lost on Glastonbury Mountain. I do have theories about what happened to all 5 of the people in the Bennington Triangle. And the truth is, they can all be different theories, right? Our brains like to make connections between things that may or may not actually be related. There's even a term for it, apophenia. It's a very normal brain function that almost everyone experiences. So even though we like to make connections, it's probable that these cases aren't even connected at all. Let's start with Mitty. Yes, he was an experienced hunter and an experienced outdoorsman, and he knew the mountain very well. But it's been stated that the winds are pretty wild on Glastonbury Mountain and can turn around pretty much anyone. According to historical weather data, during the day when the group was together, the temperature outside was about 53 degrees. Pretty nice out for November, I have to say. And the temperature stayed pretty good up until that snowfall several days after Mitty disappeared. So I don't think that he succumbed to the elements after getting lost. Mitty disappeared from the group sometime before 4 p.m. And that day, the sun set at 4:33 p.m. I think what probably happened to Mitty is that he injured himself. Or potentially he fell down one of the area's many unmarked mine shafts. That would most likely be a fatal injury and would explain why his body was never found. Many people have theories about Paula Weldon, including one where she runs away with her lover. And I do like the idea of that romantic notion, but I don't actually think that's what happened to Paula Weldon. Remember those 4 winds? They can change weather patterns drastically and quickly. And that's exactly what happened on the day that Paula Weldon disappeared. When she left her dorm, it was 50 degrees outside. Perfect weather for the parka that she was wearing and jeans. But by the next morning, it was 9 degrees outside. The temperature dropped drastically, it was even windier, and snow had begun to fall. I think she was unprepared for the temperature drop and the weather change. And she probably tried to find the smallest area to stay warm because she couldn't find her way back home. She simply succumbed to the elements. Because the area is so massive, that's probably why her body hasn't been found yet. Okay, so James Tedford is the one that everybody talks about and everybody quotes because it seems to be the strangest one. Someone just disappears off of a bus seat in the middle of a bus ride. So it gets a lot of attention. I think it's probably more likely that he just never did end up back on that bus in Burlington, Vermont. The bus driver and some passengers did claim to see him on the bus after that stop, but we all know that eyewitness testimony is historically unreliable. It is possible that they remembered incorrectly. I don't want to get too much into his mental health history because, for one, relatively little is known about him and it's kind of none of my business. But he was a war veteran, so as we know, war veterans do tend to suffer from mental illnesses after they return from war, including PTSD. There has to be a reason that he was living in a home for veterans instead of at his home with his wife. Is it possible that something like PTSD could have affected his ability to live a functioning life alone and something happened to him when he got off at a scheduled stop that wasn't his? I suppose if you have an extraterrestrial bee in your bonnet, this is the most likely case where there is alien abduction involved. I don't want to go too deeply into the Paul Jefferson case because he was a child, but suffice it to say he was a child walking alone on a highway. He was undoubtedly the most vulnerable of all the victims, and he was also in the most open area. I think it's possible, maybe even probable, that Paul was abducted. And no, I don't think his parents killed him and fed him to the hogs. Lastly, I think Freda suffered a similar fate to Mitty. First of all, let's start with this. Why are people camping in Vermont in November? I sort of just feel like people are asking for trouble. I don't know, maybe that's just me. I do not like the cold. The weather was pretty good when they were out on their camping trip, and it shows it didn't get bad until about 4 days later. We can't really use the same theory as Mitty because remember that Freda's body was eventually found. So a mine shaft just doesn't really work there. It seems like a pretty short distance from the campsite to where she fell into that stream, but the truth is, people have been getting lost in shorter distances in that area for centuries. I think it's likely that she did get lost. The wind patterns during that day, according to historical weather data, were about 15 miles per hour, which is pretty windy. It's possible she got turned around, and actually being experienced in hiking in the outdoors may have been a disadvantage in this case. It's possible she strayed further and further and further away from the campsite, actually thinking that she was getting closer. I think it's possible that she was attacked and killed by an animal such as a bear. And let's be real, not finding a body in an area that's already been searched, that happens all the time, even in our modern true crime stories. This was 70 years ago. If it can happen now by today's search standards, certainly it could happen then. The truth is that planes crash unexpectedly. People get lost. And you can see any kinds of lights in the night sky if you look long enough. Conspiracies are fun, but that doesn't make them any more true. Okay, I don't really want to talk about Bigfoot though because that guy freaks me out. So what do you think? Do you believe in the paranormal? If so, what do you believe in? What about extraterrestrials? Any alien fans out there? And what about this brain phenomenon that we have where everybody seems to make connections between things, whether or not they're related? And what happened to these people? Is there a logical, practical explanation about what happened to them? Or do we have to delve into the supernatural? Do you think we'll ever really know? Thanks for hanging out with me. Next week, I'm covering a very scary case about a woman who would do whatever it took to protect herself and the life of her unborn child from potential murder and definite mayhem. We're also traveling to Kentucky, so we'll be using a new kind of alcohol to form the basis of our margarita. Speaking of which, I don't know if you knew, but I do put the ingredients for this week's margarita and next week's margarita into the description box, so be sure to add those ingredients to your shopping list. I thought this margarita was going to be pretty gross, but honestly, it's delicious. I could see myself drinking it for breakfast. I'll see you next week. And remember, there are always alternatives to murder and hiking up a mountain that is likely to kill you.